Hello and welcome to the Imagine Festival today. We are so glad that you could be with us. I would ideally love to be having this conversation live with a glass of wine in hand, but unfortunately we're online, but we're still delighted to have you with us. And I'm delighted to have a special guest with me today and for the conversation we're going to have over the next hour or so. I'm going to be your host today. My name is Jan Carson. I'm based here in East Belfast. I don't know where you're joining us from in the world today. And I'm very excited about who I'm going to be talking to today. Let me introduce her. Sinéad Gleeson is an Irish Book Award winning writer, editor and freelance broadcaster. She edited 2016's The Long Gaze Back and then The Glass Shower. And in 2020, the absolutely massive beast of a book, The Art of the Glimpse, which we're going to be talking about in a little minute, which features 100 Irish short stories. In 2019, she released her own first book, Constellations, which was published in the UK by Picador. And it's a collection of personal essays. It was shortlisted for so many book prizes. I'm not going to name them all, but they included the Rathbones Folio Prize and the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. And it was Non-Fiction Book of the Year at the Irish Book Awards 2019 and the Dalkey Literary Award for Emerging Writer in 2020. So fair to say it's gone down pretty well. Sinead's also had quite a long career before she came to publishing and writing. She presented the book show on RTE Radio 1 for quite a while, and she was also writer in residence at University College Dublin, I think about a year ago or 2 years.
2 years, that's crazy. Time is an infinite loop now, as we all know. So yeah, 2 years.
Wow, that feels like yesterday, Sinead.
I know.
Before we get started, I'm going to ask you, how are you? Where are you? And how has this strange last year been for you?
I'm okay, actually. It's up and down. I think at everybody it's the same. You have good weeks and bad. And again, I'm aware that everybody I know is safe and well, and we have somewhere to live and food to eat and all those things. And I've been largely untouched by COVID, apart from the big things that we're all grappling with festivals like this online, not traveling, children at home and not at school. So those things are difficult, but safe and well. I think this lockdown weirdly feels almost worse in many ways. There was not quite a novelty to the first wave of it by any stretch, but this one feels we're almost there. But a year is a long time, so I think everybody's very fatigued and fed up. But then the vaccines are rolling out, so there's the buds are on the trees. There's a feeling of optimism. So yeah, I'm good, but I'm in Dublin and it's getting very windy and rainy, and no change there really. So
no.
How are you?
I am grand. I'm just going to say I've got my wee daffodils behind me as a nod to spring is coming, hopefully. Yeah, just a very strange year, and mostly a bit of a kind of slog, but then kind of punctuated by wee moments of joy and moments of, like, you're a bit like myself, we were traveling hectically, so it's been, some parts of it has been nice to settle for a wee while, and then I'm ready to get the suitcase out again now.
Yeah, I feel that as well. I've missed, there's lots of things I didn't get to go to and do, and I love going to festivals because you get to meet other writers, you get to meet readers, and that you learn so much about your own work, things you don't spot in your own work from talking to people afterwards who tell you about it. And even just getting on the train and busting out a book or the laptop, or I haven't been anywhere, I haven't seen anyone, so it's all been a bit it's been very interior kind of year in a lot of ways, but yeah, I'm the same. I'm a bit ready to go somewhere, not leave the country, mind, but I could definitely get out of Dublin. I think. I wish I was in Belfast, such a great city.
I know, and I wish I was in Dublin. We'll do a swap.
Absolutely.
I want to talk to you about two books today, Sinead. I'm going to begin with this one, which The Art of the Glimpse, which is only recently out, and if I turn it sideways, you'll see what an enormous project it was. Sinead, I'm just wondering, to get us started and give us a wee bit of a context, could you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in this project?
Yeah, certainly. I could see you struggling to lift it up there. It's a big beast, and three of them make the ideal height for a laptop Zoom event. I can tell you that right now. But they are that size because they're published by a publisher called Head of Zeus, and this is an ongoing series of theirs that it's always 100 stories. It's non-negotiable, and they tend to pick a theme. The most recent one is Frank Wynne has has done an LGBT collection of queer writing. He did a previous excellent one on stories in translation. They've done ghost stories and science fiction and women and all sorts of stuff. So Neil Belton, who's the publisher there, was aware that I had published previous anthologies, including The Glass Door, which you were also in, John. And he said, look, we want someone to do an Irish one, a kind of a sort of a best of, a recommended 100 Irish stories you must absolutely read, but you can put whatever you like in there, but they kind of have to have already been published to save you commissioning 100 stories. The book would have taken me 10 years if I was doing that. And it started from there. So again, it seems like it would take you a long time to get to 100 stories. And then, as you know, we're in the middle of not just this current wave, but we've always had loads of publishers here, north and south, loads of writers, north and south. You're almost spoiled for choice. And I think that that's increased and accelerated in the last 10 years, particularly, especially with the amount of short story collections getting published as first books. And we've seen that happen, you know, with Nicole Flattery, Wendy Erskine, all sorts of people. So the number crept up quicker than I expected. And then it's kind of, oh, how am I going to fit everybody in? And you know, if you've ever been involved in an anthology, what happens then is you hit roadblocks, which can be, you know, money. Some people want an awful lot of money for a story by somebody who's been dead for a very long time, or, you know, you just can't clear the copyright, or someone is so obscure, which has been my experience with all the anthologies. It's hard to find that you can't find who's supposed to give you permission to use the story. So they're the things. There's stories that aren't in this book that I would dearly love to have been in, but, you know, maybe down the road I'll find a way to use them somewhere.
I'm going to ask you a sneaky question here, because the last time I chatted to you, I think about anthologies was just after The Glass Shore, and you were like, never again, Jan, never again. And it's actually in your introduction, like, if somebody approaches you saying, would you like to edit an anthology? Why on earth did you let yourself get talked into this again, Sinead?
Well, part of the lure, I think, was, as I mentioned, not commissioning, because if you're commissioning new stories from scratch, which I'd done with The Long Gaze Back and The Glass Door, that means you're editing people's work. So that's a lot of back and forth. Now, if you choose wisely and you pick excellent writers, you won't have very much editing to do on their work at all. But sometimes you hit some, you know, some bumps, and there's some queries, and you have to sort of fix some stuff. So I feared if I'd had to do that with 100 brand new stories, it would have been an awful lot more work, and maybe even needed someone else, a co-editor, to work alongside me. I'm actually co-editing another book at the moment, which is non-fiction, with somebody else on a very specific theme, but I'm probably going to do more of the editing side of it. But it's completely different to fiction. And I think another bonus part of working on Arthur Glimpse is that as I said, there's loads of stories I've accumulated along the way. I'm sort of like a bit of a magpie with short stories. I always buy anthologies in secondhand shops when I see them from all over the world, not just Irish ones. I subscribe to a number of literary journals, most of them Irish, and, you know, keep in touch with what's going on and who's out there. So I had a sort of a long kind of, oh, I remember that story I really liked. And then with the previous two, there's some that just couldn't fit in. They were much smaller books. You know, Long Gaze Back was 30 stories, Glass Shore was 25. So you always have some leftover things that you keep them in your back pocket. Mm-hmm. So I already knew there'd be, if I opened my computer and had a poke around what was in my own files, I already had a load of stories. So, and then you get to use the work that you hadn't used before. Again, like the previous anthologies were all female. So this way I could go back to Joyce and, you know, Brenton B. and Liam O'Flaherty, you know, whoever I wanted, really. So so I was talked into it with the promise of somebody saying, we'll help you clear all the rights, because that's the tricky legwork stuff as well. So I went, okay, I'll do it. You know, total amnesia till I was back in the thick of it.
I'm being a bit sneaky here today, because I'm just about to start editing an anthology, which is my first experience of it.
Holler if you want any advice.
Taking notes here furiously on the side. I guess when you come to a project as big as this, there must be some criteria that you're working to. Did you have certain criteria or a process, or, you know, what was the selection process like? You said you already had some in mind. I have visions of you written through old cardboard boxes in museum archives and libraries and things.
Yeah, that happens with every collection, because the unfortunate thing with anthologies is that you do get a bit of a bug for them. And each anthology that anybody produces, even if it's, you know, if somebody else is doing an Irish anthology next year, which I'd love someone else to do, so it's not just me and my choice and my subjectivity, you're kind of looking at it from the point of view, every book has to be something new. There's no point in putting out 10 anthologies that all kind of look the same with the same people in them. And my experience of The Long Gaze Back, of trying to create a new kind of canon for Irish women, and then for Northern Irish women with The Glass Shore, was because most of the anthologies had excluded them, or the same people turn all the time to be edited in the past anyway, but by men. So every time you're making a book like this, it has to say something new. And in a weird way, though you're pulling and drawing from published work and older work, an anthology like this is a bit of a barometer. It does take the temperature of what's going on around, and you can draw on work from quite a long time ago that feels completely current and new. There's a Norah Holt story, for example, written in the 1940s that is about sex work that does obviously it was banned, and not the kind of work you'd expect to see or that looks or feels contemporary, even though it's as old as it is and been published in the South as it was. But I think what it can do is it can showcase an awful lot of work that would have been forgotten. And I've used the term a lot, literary archaeology, because you do have to dig. And I think if you're going to do an anthology, it's very easy to pick the usual stuff, the stuff that's appeared in other books. But that doesn't interest me. So while it requires more work and it is more of a time commitment, I think you have to go looking. And I always wanted to bring, a handful of sort of gems, or people, even people who are very well up on their short stories might not have heard of. Somebody like you would know everybody, Jan, but there's people who are kind of like, oh, well, I don't know who that is. And I've seen this happening in conversations around the book online with people discovering writers that they didn't know, or knowing of, writers they thought only wrote novels and discovered that there were some short stories as well. So that makes it interesting for me as well, to try and find the unusual stuff, the hard to get stuff. You get really, dog with a bone. You really want to sort of find the stuff that's hard to find. And also I think, bringing back writers who deserve more acclaim, and just by circumstance or money or personal reasons, or, their publisher folded or their editor died, whatever that is, sometimes somebody can slip away who should really be more revered and more broadly read.
No, exactly. And I think that last point is really, when I go into secondhand bookshops and I find things that are now out of print, and you think about the work that went into creating it, and now, that author's maybe dead, their work's out of print, it's not being read, and it should be. I mean, an anthology like this is doing us all a great service. One of the things that I have loved is watching people engage with the book. There's been a whole Twitter read along where people are reading a story a day and responding, or a story a week. And they're bringing up those wee gems of both writers they haven't discovered before, and also writers who are maybe writing in a different style from what they're used to. So, someone who is normally known for very realist fiction, and you find something that's a bit more fantastical. I wonder if you would pick out a few of Sinéad Gleeson's gems, so that, your favourite stories that are in here that you think just a bit different, something you might not expect.
Yeah, I think the stories I tend to gravitate towards are the ones that, people I really want to push onto people. And I always say that about Norah Holt. And the thing about Norah Holt is, like, she only died in 1984, and there's a huge volume of work, like 26 books. And yet nobody has been talking about her for a long time. And it was, I found her in an anthology and included her in The Long Gaze Back. And then Louise Kennedy, who we know, who was, doing her PhD at Queen's, she discovered Norah and was doing a kind of creative critical PhD, and half of it is on Norah. So she said, like, I would never have found Norah as a subject had she not appeared in The Long Gaze Back. And then myself and Louise have both written forwards to books that have been republished by Norah, by New Island, since what happened around The Long Gaze Back. So it just goes to show, writers can be literally resurrected from the dead. And I love the idea that Louise is such an admirer of hers. There's a story in the book, and again, somebody who I had not heard of. It was another academic, and I think we both probably know that academics are just saintly in terms of how they keep the work of dead writers going. Sometimes the only people who are reading some writers are academics who are studying, uncovering their work, and trying to get their work out there to broader readers and to publishers. So there's an amazing woman who used to teach in UCC called Pat Coughlin, and she's done a lot of work on Irish women. And we both were giving a paper at an event. I was speaking about Maeve Brennan, and she started talking about a woman called Elizabeth Cullen, who had lived in Ireland for quite a while, but is considered Irish American. There are only 2 short story collections, both published in the 70s. She only died this year, believe it or not. And I hadn't heard a thing about her. And she'd been really quite acclaimed and published work in the New Yorker. And the story is about it's called A Swim, and it's about a terrible date. It's about a woman going to Howth, just north of Dublin, with a man, and she really likes him, and she's lonely, and they're trying to make a fist of this thing, and it's clearly they don't gel, and it's not going to work. And I think it's more because of him. And I was talking to somebody about the story, and they said to me, "You do realise that's another famous Irish writer, the guy she's on the date with?" And I said, I did not know this. And the writer in question is actually in The Art of the Glimpse. So I love the idea that these two people who would never have, their relationship didn't work out, but somehow in 2020 they've ended up a chunk of pages apart from each other in the collection. I really love Owen de Vardoon's story collection because it's very much rooted in traveller culture and folklore and the landscape in Ireland. He's just been nominated for the Children's Book Ireland Book of the Year as well. And it's a story about, you know, it's about grief, but it's about how we're so connected to nature. It's about a tree. It's called the yew tree, or he talks about it in Kant, in his kind of traveller language, and it's very short story. It's incredibly short, but it's really evocative and sad, and it talks so much about the connection. But you know that we're all very much rooted to place, and sometimes there's a very thin line between, you know, trees and people. There's tons of stories, and I mean, also a writer from the north that I wanted to mention, who is one of these very hard to find writers, is Janet Mcneill, who I did include in the Glass Shore, and I know that Turnpike have been doing wonderful work with trying to get her work back out into the world. And there was stories in, you know, the Evening Press and the Belfast Telegraph. And the story in the book is just a heartbreaking story about a brother and sister who are lonely and neither have married. And it's almost too much. It's almost too much to read. It's almost an ache. But it's that characterization that, I mean, a short story essentially is, as you'll know, Jan, as such an experienced crafter of the form, it's like opening the door into somebody's sitting room or bathroom or bedroom for 10 minutes and then closing it. You get to see a scene, and it's that glimpse, which is where the title comes from which William Trevor said about Margaret Barrington, who's from Donegal, and that's how he described her work. And it is that idea of like just jumping into someone's life for a moment, and they're the kind of stories that I like, where you get maybe it's often a short period of time, like an afternoon or an hour or a morning or a few days. Anything longer than that, it's probably not a short story. But they're the kind of stories that I like. But yeah, so many. There's a beautiful Brendan Behan short story as well. That's a rare version of the story. Brendan Behan was, you know, certainly not at the time openly bisexual, and it's a very beautiful queer love story. And the version of it, he panicked when he thought it was going to get published in Ireland. It was originally published in France, and I think he didn't want that very explicit ending. And it's not even that explicit when we read it now. It's actually quite romantic, but he kind of thought, if anybody in Ireland reads this, I don't really want them knowing that bit about me. So this is the version. It has been republished, but in a hard to find version. And again, it was a wonderful academic in UCD who's doing a PhD on Bean, who said to me, you have to publish that version. Don't publish that one. You know, this is it's the one with the more beautiful ending. It's the better version. And that's the thing about short stories is, I don't know, John, how many drafts do you do of a short story? Probably.
How long?
One, I'll just faint.
No, I'm having a personal crusade at the minute against these writers who do everything in a first draft. It's just, I can't get my head around that.
I couldn't do that.
No. I mean, I wanted to ask you, because I think this is really interesting. Anywhere else in the world that you go, you know, you say I'm a short story writer, and the first question you get is, have you a novel in you? Where's the novel? Yeah. It's the opposite in Ireland. In Ireland, you say I'm a novelist, and they say, what's wrong with you? Can you not master the short story?
Yeah.
Why is the short story such a big thing in Ireland? You know, it really is that kind of testing ground of a writer. And when you talk about the art of a glimpse, of being able to contain these worlds in a little moment, 4 or 5 pages, why is it held in such high esteem here?
I think being able to write a good short story is the mark of a great writer, because I think they're so much harder to do than novels. There are so many more rules. By their nature, there's that brevity, and that, you know, everybody assumes that that there will be some sort of epiphany, or something terrible will have happened, or there'll be a fundamental change, or the character will have realized something, or all the things we know and think we know about short stories. So in order to achieve that, that's a very specific requirement. It's also it's almost the rule of it. Whereas in a novel, there are no rules in a novel. You can do what you like, and you can mess up and go off the point many times over 200 or 300 pages. You just certainly can't do that in a short story, and you're found out quicker in a short story. I remember a few years ago, when I used to work in TV, I did an interview with witty Aimahara, who's the Maori writer. And he said that he thought it was very, very interesting that the Irish and the Maori were languages that were very rooted in their own cultures and their own specific language, and that we were a very talky and verbal kind of culture. And he said a short story is essentially, you know, like telling a long story at the bus stop in some ways, which it is. And again, going back to, you know, the whole idea of the Irish Shanachie is people used to tell stories in their head that took about 20 minutes to tell, which is what a short story takes to tell. So I think that form is the idea that it's finishable for writers, but it also is, it's kind of like a mini explosion in the way that a novel is more of a slow burn. And I think people get something from that. I remember when Kevin Barry published his first collection, he used to have his line that he would say that there was a time in Ireland that if you went into a publisher with a short story collection, it was like dragging a corpse in behind you. And which is a great line, but it's also not true anymore, as you say. I mean, I do know people who've gotten deals, but a publisher does say, well, do you have a novel? But then that's a bit more security for a writer if you get a 2-book deal. You do your stories, you do your novel. But I think here there's something we gravitated towards it because it's a very finessed kind of form, and we're very good at it here. And I think Irish writers like to show off that they're good at it in a way, because you could argue that most people, a novel is engine, but I think you need there's something else you need for the short story that you don't need for the novel. The novel is just the work and sitting down and putting in the coal in the fire. Of course, it's more than that, but I just think the short story is where you'll be found out as to whether you're a good writer or not.
Was really interesting, like recently in the Irish Times, there was both Conor O'Callaghan and Colum McCann were debating how easy it is to write narrative and how easy it is to write kind of lyrically and poetically. And I think the short story almost requires both. And to me, part of the reason the short story is big in Ireland is because of the tradition of poetry here as well, because the language really matters in short stories as well.
Absolutely. I always say the short story is closer to poetry than it is to the novel, and people assume that it's the novel because they're both fiction. I completely disagree. It's even closer in many ways to drama, and there's such a great tradition of brilliant dramatists in the North, and the poets, you know, Heaney, Longley, Brian Friel, because it's a very verbal kind of form. You know, there are plenty of you can have people talk for 4 or 5 pages of a novel, but percentage-wise, it's not very much of your novel. Whereas the short stories, it's a very dialogue-driven, because dialogue is a way to quickly tell a story. It's a way of not being too exposition-y, but getting to the point in 10 pages. But I think they're really hard to do. And yet I love that more people are taking chances and risks on them. And I think that is also to do with there are more places to publish them now. And so people feel, also there's the idea that if I spend weeks on this, it is 10 pages. It's not like committing my life to 500 pages of a book that I may or may not decide I like or want to publish in the end. So they're a great place for experimentation. There's a brilliant, the Penguin book of the British short story by Philip Hensher. It's in 2 volumes, and he says something really interesting in the introduction to that, where he says that in the 20s, a lot of the writer like Somerset Maugham and before that Dickens often used like the Strand and magazines like that to try out their weird stuff that they'd never dream of writing a novel about. You know, there's sci-fi or there's speculative stuff or strange things that their publishers would not let them publish, or they wouldn't serialize, maybe in Dickens' case, in a newspaper, but it gave them a chance to go off and be experimental and try something out. And that's one of the things universally nearly every short story writer tells me: I can try something out and it won't feel like I've wasted months on something if it doesn't work, or it could turn out to be something great, and I'm glad I took the risk, you know. So yeah, it encourages and I think facilitates experimentation and risk taking.
I'm going to ask you one more question about the art of the guns before we move on. You've already mentioned, and I love that anecdote about the story with the 2 writers going off on a date together. So the stories are talking to each other in a very literal sense, that they collide and connect. And I guess this is a horrible question to ask you, but you know, are there themes that come up across the whole collection that you think perhaps this identifies what an Irish short story is, that makes it maybe different from a North American or a British short story or whatever? And I know you've talked about, you know, some of the more contemporary ones feel like a snapshot of contemporary Ireland with all of the issues and the complexities. But I mean, the stories go back quite a long time into the past as well. So do they talk to each other in any way?
Yeah, they absolutely do. There's a lot of stories that feel weirdly like they're having a conversation. A lot of them are, and again, for a long time, I think anyone would, if you'd been asked what a short, when I studied the short story when I studied UCD, I studied in English in UCD, and we had the William Trevor Oxford book of the Irish short story, and it's full of beautiful stories. And you know, it's Liam O'Flaherty, it's Frank O'Connor, Mary Lavin, Edna O'Brien, all of the people you expect. Again, 39 men, 7 women, and it's a beautiful book, but it is very much, all of the work in that is very realist. It's all set in certain places, so it's all very rural work. It's often about farms, it's about complicated families, it's about sadness, it's about emigration, and those themes are themes that I think are never really going to go away when you're in island culture like we are. And the thing is, emigration is not a permanent thing anymore, and technology has impacted and changed what emigration means and can be, because we're more connected than we were before. It's not a permanent forever end of, that's the end of things as it once was. So I think, yeah, I mean, all writers write about the same things, no matter whether American or Irish. They're all writing about love and death and relationships and complications and, shame and bodies and, all the stuff we all talk about. But in terms of what makes an Irish writer intrinsically Irish, that I think has changed, because there's so much of the contemporary work, and I include your own work in that, Jan, and Wendy Erskine, and a ton of the new writers coming up now. It's hard to place them as Irish unless they specifically name a place name. You can hear it sometimes in speech and vernacular, because we're so familiar. We know how people speak on this island of ours, so you can tell. That does. your man, for example, is probably not going to be somebody who's gone to Harrow is going to speak like that. Yeah. So there are ticks and things that identifies, but I think more than that, it is more universal. And I maybe because technology has made the world a much more global place, that the lines between nations and identities have sort of have grown a little bit closer. And yet, I'm excited about the kind of new Irish writing that we start to see. People like Chiamaka Enyi, who's the wonderful story in the book, and Polish Irish writers, Brazilian Irish writers, Nigerian Irish writers. That really interests me, because it's upending the idea of what's Irish and who gets to call themselves Irish and who gets to say that a piece of work is just Irish because it's not set in a farm or there isn't a priest or an alcoholic in it. So yeah, it's changing a lot, but I think good work has the same universal sort of themes, because they are the stuff we're all trying to figure out, all the questions we're trying to answer in life, and we try and answer them on the page. So of course they recur.
It's quite nice sometimes that we're moving away from that kind of sad potato fiction. We've got quite a lot of it.
I'm going to call it that from now on, sad potato fiction.
Yeah. And you're contributing yourself to the canon, Sinead. You're, you've written short stories. You're working on a novel at the minute.
Yeah. Allegedly, yeah.
You're working on a novel. I know you're working very, very hard. And I guess I wanted to ask, as we smoothly transition into your own writing here, editing and looking at all of this incredible work and reading it, has that had an impact on your own writing? Like, how has it shaped it in any way?
Oh, that's a very good question. It's funny, I kind of, the last few months where I did finish the draft of a novel before Christmas, and I haven't had any time to look at it, and I kind of need to have nothing else going on, but I have loads of things going on, so it'll be a few weeks before I get back to it. I think you kind of need that immersion at the start of something big, and you'd probably know more about that than me, Jan. But I had to read a lot of fiction because I was judging a prize, and it was really interesting actually to sort of see there's no, and I've learned this over the years with short stories and editing other people's work, there's no right or wrong way to tell a story. There is good and bad writing for sure, but there's no right or wrong way. And I love seeing how other people do it. And one of the judges in the prize was kind of saying that he's a poet, and he said, I want to write fiction. And he said, and it's actually been like an education for me, reading all these books that I wouldn't have known about or known to pick up. So for me, I think I've had this, the idea for the novel has been with me for a really long time. In fact, it was started a long time before Constellations, and it was an idea that it's awful. And I said this to someone, and they said, that's just the way it kind of works. When I said, I can't get away from it. If I try and forget it, I've tried to literally bury it out the back like a body, and it just keeps like crawling out of the earth and like dragging its corpse back into the house. And they were like, well, then you're just going to have to do it. So there is that, and it feels very singular to me, but yeah, I can't think of things that it's specifically, weirdly, the things that I think have influenced it are more visual things, more filmic things than actual books that I've read. And yet I know that when I eventually finish it and it's edited and I go back, I'll be able to see, and that's the way it was with Constellations. I saw more connections, and I saw what things were more about, or what I was thinking, or maybe the things that had influenced me only when I got to the end, because you kind of have to think about it as this weird amorphous big thing until you finish it and you're ready to give it to somebody else to edit for you. I don't know, but you can't think about it. See, you can't overthink it. I think no matter what you're writing, if you keep second guessing yourself as you're doing it, you can talk yourself out of things, and you can start to edit and take things out, and that can be fatal for a narrative, but also for a whole book. You know, it can mess it up. You start getting too censorious too quickly. You know, you have to write with the handbrake off, with your foot up to the floor. You know.
I mean, one of the things that I've really felt like reading The Art of the Glimpse, reading this explosion of Irish fiction in the last wee while, like, I don't know if you're the same as me, you get asked all the time, is it intimidating having this community of people winning so many awards and producing such incredible stuff? And it doesn't feel like that. It feels like the phrase that always comes to mind for me, it's a line from the Bible about having a great cloud of witnesses, kind of like people that are running beside you, cheering you on, kind of thing, and inspiring you in a weird way.
Absolutely. And I think that's really true. I think there's an awful lot of solidarity, and writers from other countries have remarked on this to me, about there's an awful lot of community and support of other writers, particularly online, or, you know, at festivals, or you know, you put something up on Twitter and loads of other people will congratulate you on it, or ask you about it, or ask you for, you know, to read their work, or you will offer to read theirs. I do feel there's a real sense of community there. And when I read good work, that inspires me to do better, to try and make it better. And it's the same with the thing that it seems like a really obvious thing to say, but when I am having times when I can't write and the well feels dry, and there's been a lot of that over the last year, picking up books by writers I like that you know is going to be good. Like I was working on a couple of essays lately and was finding it kind of hard, and I picked up a book by a writer I really like, Olivia Lang, who just can't write a bad word. Yeah. And it's not that I'm writing about the same things, because we're not in these two essays anyway, but it's just how she brings things together, and how you can kind of throw things onto the page, and how you can make them work. And I don't write at all like Olivia Lang, but reading good work makes you want to go off and do your own work, even though it won't be anything like that work. It inspires you to go, okay, this is the standard. I have to pick myself up and keep going, even when I'm not feeling it, or the tank is a bit empty. But yeah, so reading good work encourages you, but also other writers have been very supportive and have kept me going. We all have writer pals and writer WhatsApp groups where you're just going, nothing I say is any good, and someone else will go, no, here, you know. So you need that. We all need that. Because it's very solitary, this thing we do, Jan. I mean, you're the same. It's very solitary, isn't it?
Okay, and like particularly this year, like I'm completely by myself in the house in my own head. So you become very, very reliant on the community that's there online. And for me anyway, this year has been, I thought online community was maybe a kind of fickle, thin thing, but actually I've realized there's quite a bit of depth to it, you know, as we letters arrive in the post, and like, this is my treasure shelf behind me. All of these things have appeared from different writers at different points in the year just to keep you going. So there is a depth to that community, I think, as well.
Yeah, and again, we are people who sit in rooms either doing lots of research or making things up, and it requires you to be on your own. You can't focus and do it if you're not on your own. And that's why the festivals and going into the world and meeting other writers is so important, because you spend a lot of time alone grappling with people who aren't real, your fictional creations. And that's why this year has felt weird and strange. And I've really felt for, I mean, I know myself, you and I were book twins, Jan, our books, Fire Starters and Constellations were published on the exact same day. And we were lucky when we think about it, because there's a lot of wonderful writers, including debut writers, who had books out last year who didn't get to do all the stuff that we got to do. So again, that's another thing I'm grateful for, and feel bad for others that they didn't. So I hope it's not too much longer before we're able to. I miss being crammed up against somebody drinking really crappy warm white wine in the bookshop, but you know, well the windows are all fogged up. I miss that, you know.
Right, watch this for a transition into the next thing. Because about, I think 3 years ago, we were in the weirdest motel together in outside San Francisco at a book festival, drinking crappy white wine in the sun, and eating cold pizza for some reason.
I think there have been numerous occasions we've drank crappy white wine together, Jan. I'm also thinking about Dundee and your lost manuscript. You've just made me think.
Oh, that's a horrific memory. This is a nice one, because that night was the night that you told me that you'd signed with Picador and Constellations was on the way. And I guess back then, did you ever think that this book would have such a life? You know, it's now being translated into different languages, it's won prizes. Why do you think it resonated so much with everyone? Because it has really resonated across the world.
Honestly, I didn't expect. I said to my agent, I said, if I publish it and it doesn't get trashed too much and a few people read it, that'll be grand. I'm actually okay with that. I just, I put a lot into it, and it's, as you know, like there's a lot of my heart and my soul are in that book. But I guess one of the reasons, and I can't speculate, but all I can tell you is that what has happened a lot when I've done festivals and met readers afterwards is that a lot of people want to talk about a lot of the things that I talk about in the book, and whether that's, grief or, the loss of family members. A lot of people want to talk to me about illness and disability. A lot of people want to talk about terrible experiences with doctors or living with chronic pain, and things that are not often the kind of sexy, cool things to write about. They're the kind of the inadequacies that some of us deal with our bodies, the things that we feel ashamed about having to talk about, the fact that, I need to have a lift in my shoe, or I have to use crutches, or I'm having more surgery, or all of those things. And a lot of people, being a patient is a very isolating and lonely experience, whether that's being in hospital, or whether that's being laid up in bed, or whether that's just you can't leave your house because of chronic pain. And I've met a lot of people brilliantly over the last year online, people who wouldn't be able to come to events that I've done, but can come online. So the accessibility thing has been brilliant. So I think one of the reasons maybe is that people saw themselves in it. And I have an essay in that book where I talk about seeing the paintings of Frida Kahlo and reading the work of Lucy Greeley and looking at the photography of Joe Spence, people who articulated their own struggles with their bodies were, and Kahlo was a big one because I spent most of my teenagers in hospital or on crutches or in pain, and finding somebody who was able to articulate the pain, I kind of thought, okay, well, she was able to not just articulate it, then she made a life out of it and she turned her art into something. So it wasn't all bad and it wasn't all a waste. It feels like that now because it's grim when you're 14 and you've missed another 3 months of school. But finding that kind of recognition. So I think that's what it was. A lot of people saw themselves represented that maybe haven't seen themselves represented. And I think one of the key themes of the book, and again, I've been asked about this a lot over the last year, is empathy. And I think a lot of people in the world we're living in, particularly in this last year, are starting to think about other people for the first time, are starting to negotiate with the idea that one day they might get ill. They might never have thought about it until COVID came along. But they've known people get sick and die from this illness. There's hundreds of ways to die. COVID is just one of them. But I think a lot of people are grappling with their own mortality and their bodies, and that's been a lot of the conversations that I've had. And of course, not all of the book is about that, and you've done so much brilliant work, Jan, on dementia. A lot of people have talked to me about that essay and about just, it's to be human is to be really kind of fallible, and to have a body is to have a functioning one that never messes up is the biggest gift anybody could ever get. And most of us don't realize it until something happens. So I think lots of people who've never been sick also related to the book in a way, just going, God, I didn't realize I actually have a pretty good life, having never broken a bone or been in hospital or been anyway seriously ill. So yeah, I think it maybe reminded people to focus on what they have and not what they don't. Maybe that's what people have told me at events.
I think I'm going to jump back to the point that you made a wee minute ago about COVID throwing us all into this question of thinking about big issues around health, illness, mortality even, and that question of empathy. It's something that you talk about, you talk about, it runs through all of the essays really in here. And it's something I've thought about a lot this year, and possibly the question of where empathy runs out, because you make the point a number of times that every illness is unique and it's uniquely experienced. Like we could both be diagnosed with the same thing and have very different experiences. Absolutely. And so to ask someone to put yourself in someone else's shoes, is there a limit to what empathy can do? I've been thinking about this a lot this year. Where does empathy run out, kind of?
Yeah, and I think actually when you're on, possibly this is the most perfect time to be asking that question, Jan, because I think a lot of people, there was a lot of compliance involved over the last year. All we've been asked to do, it was a social contract, and the social contract was to protect other people, so your loved ones don't die, so your elderly parents don't die, so the people that you love and who are more vulnerable and compromised won't get ill by you doing everything you're supposed to do. And that requires a lot of empathy, because you might be you might be a triathlon person who's never been sick. That doesn't mean you won't get it, and it doesn't mean you won't pass it on to somebody who's more vulnerable than you. So I think maybe in the times we're living in now, people's empathy might be a little bit more stretched, especially when you're doing everything and you find out people have had parties or they've gone to get their teeth done in Spain or whatever it is they've gone to do. And that's an absence of empathy to me. And it makes me wonder that why has it come at this point when there's a lot of tiredness and everyone is really waiting for it all to be over. At the same time, where empathy might run out personally in our own lives, I always think that I go to fiction a lot to sort of find empathy. So much of what I find in the work that I like, even difficult work or even really comic work, is empathy, because putting yourself in the shoes of a character who's really comic but immediately and immensely remote from your own life is a way to sort of live and experience something else. That's why we read. We get to vicariously live through somebody else's eyes and ears and narration, but then close the book after 300 pages and go, God, I don't have that experience, or that wasn't my experience. And that's all it is. But I think a lot of things are currently at a limit for people because we've all had enough. But I also think that's why a lot of people started reading again. Loads of people told me they started reading again or reading more in the last year because they were looking for something else that they weren't finding on their screens, or from baking bread or whatever they were doing. I didn't bake any bread.
I know you're talking about finding empathy in reading and literature, but you find a lot of it as well in other art forms. So there's strands of music and visual art and nods to film. I can see you've got Frida up on your bookshelves behind you there.
That was a present for one of my students, actually.
I spotted that in the background. I wonder if you could talk to me a wee bit about kind of those other non-literary influences and how they've impacted your writing and your journey as an artist as well.
I think, when people talk about this amorphous thing called the arts, and to me, the arts is reading books, watching movies, watching really well-made, well-written narrative TV, going to galleries, listening to music. All of those things are the arts to me. And long before I was doing any of this stuff, I was a music journalist and I was a books journalist. I still sometimes write about books, but the years in my teens, the things that I did that I loved and adored, because I couldn't play sport, or I couldn't do lots of stuff that other people did. I couldn't join things because I was always, I'd be back in hospital. So the things you can do on your own is you can listen to music and you can read books. And that's what I did. And I'm not a very good painter or a drawer, but I did do a lot of that when I was younger too. So all of those things, I kind of turned my hobbies into my job by becoming a journalist because I was an arts journalist. And it also was really important to me. I wanted to write about a lot of personal stuff in Constellations, but I didn't want to write a memoir. I didn't want to write a book that was all about me or all about very, bodily, corporeal, big things about the body. I wanted to write about a lot of things. And that's the thing about DSC. It's a very accommodating form. It can allow you to bend it in all sorts of different ways. You can pull in, you can change the ratio all the time, 5 to 95, 50-50 in terms of your own experience and looking outwards. And I think really good essays, while they can be about your own life, have to look outwards at the world and draw other things into the kind of vortex, if you like. So all of those things, I'm obsessed with music still and with art. And I've written, separate essays since then, since that book's been published, about artists and other writers and about music. The book I'm co-editing is about music, and which I'm absolutely loving it, and I get to do it with one of my heroes. And it's so those things are never going to leave me. So I think when you're writing a book like this, maybe it's the same when you're writing a novel, John. There's things that will always elbow their way in, even if they take up one page or one scene, or maybe they're going to be a substantial part of it. And those things are they're part of who I am. And Constellations is partly a book about my experiences and who I am. So all of those things made me, the medicine and the terrible doctors and the surgery did too, but so did going to hundreds of gigs and reading thousands of books, and it seemed remiss to not include them too,
Yeah, I always say when I'm teaching, it's quite a dangerous thing when you turn on that kind of switch in yourself and you posture yourself to being open, to being inspired, because it's going to hit you from all different directions. You'll not be able to go to the cinema and not, have wee sparks of ideas going off, or there's so much in the world. I noticed down this, it comes very early in the collection, possibly even the first line. You've written the body is an afterthought, and as I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the other art forms, I wondered if the body is more of an afterthought in literature than a lot of other art forms, because there's so much physicality to something like the visual art and photography that you've mentioned. The dance physicality comes first in dance, and so I wonder if the body is mostly an afterthought in you know, in literature?
That's a super question. No one's ever asked me that, John, I have to say. Yeah, but that's a brilliant observation. And I've thought that myself. With that first line, I meant it in terms of you don't pay much attention to your body unless, you know, a car knocks it down or you're told you've got cancer or somebody kisses you, whatever, you know, whatever, something happens to it that is, you know, a non-solitary experience or isn't life-changing. But in terms of literature, yeah, it is so much of what the physical representation, you watch films, TV, you're presented with people on three-dimensional bodies and people all over the place. The same with so much of art is about, from the Pieta to, you know, the sort of, the reimagining of what a face can look like in the Cubists. Absolutely. And maybe that is a place that the body gets left behind, or people are more interested in describing what somebody thinks as opposed to, and it's not, I don't mean something as banal as describing what a person looks like, but even getting across their corporeality. I just finished reading Kazuo Ishiguro's new book, Clara and the Sun, which is brilliant on bodies and corporeality because it deals with artificial friends and robots. And there's a moment where he's so good at not describing things. He talks about a girl who doesn't walk like anybody else. And I realized about 40 pages later that she has a limp, as do I. And I just kind of thought that idea, it was a really interesting way, rather than going, she had a limp, I had to think about it. And everything in the way he describes, he talks about bodies a lot in that book, but he's trying to talk about them in relation to, you know, what makes a heart. Is everybody's human heart unique, which is kind of one of the things that which again goes back to empathy. It's your experience of all of those things, like what makes us all ultimately quite unique. But yeah, I think that's a really good observation.
I guess it came up because I'm doing a lot of study of dementia literature and narratives about dementia in fiction at the minute, and a lot of them reduce people to their mind, and that's not a reduction, because, you know, you're talking about the big things like soul and thinking and imagination, but sometimes at the expense of physicality, that you know, it's quite hard. And you know, when you look at some of the big novels that have become canonical from the past, they're very much novels of the mind rather than and contemporary fiction. To me, there's kind of a heyday of the body. The body is coming back.
And maybe there's a return to the kind of the sensual as well. And I think I don't think it's you can't write about the intellectual and write about the sensual at the same time. Loads of people do. Eimear McBride does it really well. Claire Louise Bennett does it really well. Loads of people do. But yeah, maybe that's an interesting question as to why that hasn't been there. I'm curious, and I can understand in a short story why somebody wouldn't, because often there isn't the time to get into that. But and then there's a different question register around, you know, how do you write about female bodies, because that can be problematic sometimes, as we know, especially if men are writing women, it doesn't always work out.
Yes, we've all seen a few of those examples.
Yeah.
I've been trying, because I've heard you talk about Constellations quite a few times, and I know you've talked about it a lot. So I've tried to pick out a few questions of things I've always wanted to ask you. So sorry if these are
not great questions. And no one's asked me that, so it's always great. That's you know this. It's always brilliant when somebody asks you a question that you haven't been asked, and you've been doing this a long time.
I also love the section in the essay collection where you talk about going to Lourdes as a teenager. Really, I don't know if you've read it. Flannery O'Connor went to Lourdes as well, and she talks about it as from a writerly experience, as she never really believed she was going to get healed, but she thought, this is a really good excuse to look at people and observe them. It's kind of weird. And that made me think about kind of you as an artist through the experiences you had growing up and as an adult. Was that part of being there, watching as somebody who was going to respond to it? Was that always there, or was it something you
no, I don't think so. I mean, I didn't think at 13 that I would want to be a writer. I'm not even sure I thought that at 23, because I didn't know any writers. I thought it would be a thing that would be really hard to do. I didn't know how to go about it, and then, you know, confidence and time and situations and circumstance get in the way of these things. I certainly didn't think about it then, but the thing is, it is an incredibly, and again, this comes back to the idea of film and the visual. It's a very intense place, and there's so much going on that it's really alien and strange. Like I mean, I was religious. My whole family were back then. But nothing on this level. It's like religious to you know, on crack. It's every part of the city. You can't go anywhere really where you can't be reminded that this is all about the pilgrimage, and it's all about the grotto, and it's all about, in terms of like, and to the point where it's kitsch in terms of souvenir shops and everybody involved in it, and this, you know, it has, I say in that piece, Lourdes is the only place outside after Paris that has the most hotels in France. It's like, I think it does have more hotels than Paris. It's an incredibly intense sort of place. So it's a visual sort of overload, but also I was really fully into it. I was like, I'm here for the miracle. That's mine. That I'm absolutely going to walk it, throwing off the crutches or hanging them up in the grotto like souvenirs as people do. I really believed it. And then when I was leaving there, it was very clear that that wasn't going to happen for me. But it's a really intense place, and I was meant to go back there last year to write a part 2, if you like, which I would have loved to have written, and I will do someday, I think. And I would, you know, I'd been looking up the hotels, and I was retracing the streets on Google Maps, which you can do now. I wrote about how hilly and vertiginous they were, and it's amazing to me how much I remember of it. It's really imprinted on my brain. So it must have had, you know, maybe some kind of prophetic version of myself thought I need to remember this, but it felt very significant at the time. And maybe it's just the age I was. I mean, I was 13, and everything feels, you know, exacerbated and massive and wild when you're that age, particularly as I was hopeful and excited, but also really frightened. So those things, but I can remember everything about it. So it's really vivid, more than places I've been in the last 10 years. I can remember it vividly, you know. It's strange.
I find it really interesting because it's such a different world.
Yeah, to your religious background.
Yeah. But I am right.
Is there a Lourdes equivalent in your kind of
No, I mean, I am writing a lot at the minute about charismatic faith healing, so there is that kind of aspect to it. But it kind of sounds like Disneyland for Catholics. So I might see if I could get a wee trip out at some stage.
Or go to Knock. If you can't leave the country, go down to Knock, you know, which is, where's Knock? Sligo, general direction. Or Medjugorje. I think Medjugorje is still open, but that's also your...
Maybe we could go together as kind of like, you know...
Kelm and Louise it across to religious hotspots.
Yeah, we could probably get cross-community funding for an expedition.
Absolutely. Can we get a convertible?
I don't know, yeah. That'd be a really good documentary. I wanted to ask you this, and I'm probably being devil's advocate a wee bit here, but your stories in Constellations and the stories of other brave artists who have talked about illness and talked about difficult things, they're incredibly inspiring, and they're also incredibly brave. And if you look back across what's happened in Ireland in the last wee while, legislation has been changed because particularly women have been very brave and very generous in sharing their stories. And I wanted to ask you if you think there's kind of an onus upon people who have been through difficult things to talk about them, or, you know, is it okay to withhold your story? And what do you feel like about that? You know, if you've been through something difficult, but you think sharing it could help someone else.
Yeah. I have kind of mixed feelings on it, really. It's not for everybody. And whenever I teach workshops, and it's often on creative nonfiction or memoir or life writing, whatever you want to call it, I always say to people, you know, you don't have to publish something. You can write something down, you can write a beautiful crafted essay and work on it for weeks, but you don't have to send it out anywhere. You don't have to show it to anyone. You can even throw it in the fire after you've done it and keep a document backed up somewhere in a hidden file on your computer. Because I've often had classes where people say, if I publish this, there'll be around my family, my sister won't speak to me, my mother will be ashamed of me. And that's the price. That there comes a point where you have to literally weigh it up on the scales and go, what's the reason for me publishing this? Why do I want to do this? Is it a benefit for other people? In my case, I found by and large, because I've heard from so many people, particularly ill people or people with disabilities or chronic pain, it's been because people feel seen, and that's made me feel very happy that's been the best part of it, actually, that kind of, to hear from those kind of people. But there is a price to pay for being, I also feel you have to do it properly. If you're going to write a version of it and then tone it down and then take out all the raw stuff, the important stuff, I think people will know, and I think it won't be the piece it could have been. But absolutely, I don't personally believe in catharsis. Some people say writing things down, that's where diaries might be helpful. I don't think an essay out in the public domain is the same as a diary piece, and it certainly wouldn't have that effect on me. I haven't felt any better or felt unburdened by writing these pieces, but they have made me figure things out. They have made me feel I've made a contribution to a public conversation, particularly around doctors not listening to people, doctors not believing the elderly or women or children when it comes to their own bodies and their illnesses and those things. Because I've gone to speak to doctors, I've been, done things, including in the last year on Zooms with medical professionals to talk about patient perspective and empathy. And that's a good part of the book for me. But absolutely, I realized that this is a book and it was going to go into shops. But if I thought I was, my first time out and I was going to write a painful piece and everybody in my small town was going to read it, I'd maybe think twice about it. You have to look at a lot of factors, and it's what's the price you'll pay for it? Will it be worth it? It also might be a piece that people say are incredible and gets you an agent. So there is that weighing up of, you've got to be, but if it's going to cause you distress, I wouldn't put myself through that. But it wasn't going to be like that for me. It was part of a bigger narrative and a mixed narrative kind of book. But also, lots of the work that I gravitate towards, Jan, that I love to read is often difficult to read, and work that I give students to read is often stuff that's very close to the edge, but people kind of go, God, I'm so glad I've read that. It's awful or it's sad, but it's made me feel something. It's got that empathetic response that you want in a reader. And I think that's but you don't have to publish everything. And sometimes writing something down is enough for some people. It doesn't have to be out there,
I think you're incredibly brave in talking about what you've talked about and what you've shared. And I also think you're kind of one of those writers who've done it a slightly different way around, because most often writers fictionalize their difficult stuff first, and then later on they come to owning it. So, I always think about someone like Jeanette Winterson, who's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit is just a fictionalized version, really, of why be normal when you could be happy.
And that's incredible. The best writer talk I ever saw in my life was Jeanette Winterson talking about that book at Hay, with no notes. She just got up with a microphone for an hour, and it just blew my mind. And it was absolutely brilliant. But I think I couldn't have fictionalized that. There would have been too much of my own voice. It didn't interest me at all. At no point I think I'll try and turn parts of the Constellations into the form of the essay kind of suggests itself. Sometimes content is form is content. They were always going to have to be non-fiction, and I think I would have lessened the impact of them if I'd made them fictional in a way. I wouldn't have interested me at all. And I've talked to loads of writers who tell me, God, I tell all my most honest stuff in my fiction. Like, the non-fiction's grand, but all the really dark realities of my life go into the made-up stuff, but no one ever guesses. So I'll be looking out for that now in your next book, John.
The sneaky thing is, if you just change the gender of people, no one ever recognises.
I've heard that said.
I wouldn't do that personally at all myself.
Never. Not a bit.
Sinead, that hour just went like that. I've got like about 10 more questions to ask you, but I'll just have to save them for the next time we get a pint together.
I'd love that. I would love that.
As we close, I'm not going to ask you what the novel's about or anything that's really cruel, but what can we look forward to in the next wee while from Sinead Gleeson? What's the next wee while?
What am I doing? Well, actually, funnily enough, on the visual art thing, I'm doing two different things with visual artists. I'm doing something with Aidan Barry, the wonderful video artist who's been a hero of mine for years, and Alice Marr, who's one of Ireland's greatest living writers, and Rachel Fallon are doing a group show with other artists in Ruared and Tala. That's around Mary Magdalene, and I'm doing something with them. I've got a couple of essays. I've just finally finished an essay about Maeve Brennan, you'll be pleased to hear, John, which is about walking and New York, and basically kind of going on a Maeve Brennan pilgrimage, which I did. I followed in her footsteps a few years ago. It's in a book on walking. And I've written another piece about Clarice Lispector and Brazil, which was when I was meant to go to Lourdes, but I had to write about something else. And I'm really glad in a way that I did, because I got to rediscover Clarice, who's just one of the most singular, not like anybody else kind of writers who not everybody would love her, but I love her. So all of that, and then hopefully get back to this novel, and then this music book, which will be next year. So lots going on, but all good stuff.
It sounds like you're being very lazy there, Sinead. I know. Fuck up your ideas a bit.
I know.
Listen, it's just been lovely to talk to you. Let me give a quick plug to these two books. So we've got Constellations here, which has got lovely gold in the front, so it kind of shimmers off the laptop. And then The Art of the Glimpse, which, can I also say, is extremely good value. If you're in the means of usually buying poetry, you get a lot more bang for your buck with this book, and some great stories as well. Can I thank the Imagine Festival as well for hosting us today? And big thanks to Shania Gleason. Imaginary round of applause at this stage.
Thank you, Jan, for brilliant questions as ever, and thank you for all your work and championing of other writers as you always do, and thanks so much to the festival. I hope I see you in real life very soon.